Who let the dogs out?
I love dogs.
I love dogs too.
Glad we're all on the same page.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Sarah Andreyko Show.
I'm super excited to be talking about intention when it comes to dog bites. I think there's a lot of misconception about aggression, what aggression is. I feel like that's a label that gets misused all the time. Then also when it comes to bites, I think some people underplay bites and I think people overplay bites. So some of the things I want to dive into today with you is talking about intent behind bites, like the severity of them, what it means, and from a behavior perspective, what we're going to do about it based on what we think the intent is or what the purpose is behind it. Cool. So Jim, you've got a lot of experience on this, and veterinary forensics is just one of those fields that is incredibly fascinating to me. I could puppy dog around and shadow after you for months at a time and never get bored. It's such a cool subject, and I'm really excited that you can pull in information about all of these different types of bites and how dogs bite so that we can use that information to prevent dog bites in the future from a behavior perspective. One of the things I always like to say is the dead still tell tales, the dead still talks. So,
yes.
You do a lot with fatalities when it comes to dog bites and dog attacks. So you've been able to take a lot of the information, even post-mortem, to teach us about what we can do in other cases down the road from a behavior perspective with some of this information. So thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. And, bites is, over the years, has kind of become my thing. I did my master's at the University of Florida Veterinary Forensics program, which is through the vet school in veterinary forensics. But my thesis was on the procedures and evidentiary needs of actually how to investigate serious and fatal dog attacks. Because unfortunately, I'm a retired police officer, and unfortunately, for many, many years, what happened is if somebody got killed at the worst, the police would walk in, they'd shoot the dog, they'd load up the body, and everybody went home. And that's all the information we had. And I guess around the time of the Diane Whipple attack in San Francisco, I'd gone into behavior and training, and the old cop in me surfaced because I was fortunate. I got hired very young, so I was able to retire in my early 40s. And I started looking at it wondering, the human-dog relationship is such where we kill them off all the time. But how does that relationship go? That's because we're jerks. But
Yeah.
How does that relationship go so bad that they wind up killing us? And there had been some people who had looked at it academically, people who are now friends of mine, like Dr. Randy Lockwood, who's now retiring at the ASPCA, and Dr. Jeff Sachs, who was with CDC. They wrote the initial big papers here in the U.S. back in the late 90s about breed and bites and attacks and stuff. But I started looking at it with the combination of a behavioral person and a cop, and looking at the relationship of what I could find from the evidence. And that has led me down this kind of strange path where now I'm actually finishing my Ph.D. at the vet school, and my dissertation and research is on specifically fatal and serious dog bites, and dog bites overall, and the behavioral mechanisms behind the why they're biting, how they wind up getting so sideways that a human gets seriously injured, and also, as you're putting it, intent or purpose of a bite. And up front, I like to use, it's easy to use the word intent when we're talking about something our dogs do, because we understand that they are sentient companion animals that are working with us and have emotions across a huge range and all of that. I like to use the word purpose of a bite, because intent to me kind of has some human baggage that our dogs may or may not deserve. For instance, I don't believe dogs are mean or evil or some of the human emotions like jealousy seem to have analogs within the dog behavior world. Friends of mine, such as Dr. Daniel Mills over at the University of Lincoln in England, is looking heavily into the emotions. People like Brian Hare and Clive Wynne are looking into the emotional backgrounds. But I don't like to put that human baggage on the dogs if we don't have to. So instead of saying, oh, that it's useless to say, well, the dog bit so-and-so because he's mean. No. The dog bit so-and-so because the dog felt that under those circumstances, a bite was an appropriate and reasonable way to act in that situation. A bite isn't necessary. I mean, we don't like it, but it being bitten means that somehow the dog saw that as a reasonable and appropriate behavior under the circumstances. It's simply a way, aggression is simply one of the ways for dogs to affect their environment. Aggression is not a single thing. It's a whole cluster of behaviors. And again, it's completely divorced from being mean or any of the things that we like to heap on them. It's an adaptive behavior, a behavior that helps the organism, whether it's a dog or a lizard or an amoeba, survive. I was interested recently to find out that corals that live underwater and so forth, and anemones display aggressive behaviors. They secrete chemicals that drive other competing organisms away from them so they can maximize resources. Who thought a reef of coral could be aggressive?
That's a miniature army right there.
Absolutely.
A colony of life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
go ahead.
You know, who thought an anemone, a sea anemone, little with the tentacles and everything?
Yeah.
Who thought that was aggressive? But aggressive behavior is behavior with a purpose.
Yeah, there's so many different types, so many different definitions of aggression. It's one of those things that I love to ask almost every behavior consultant that I come into contact with. What's your definition of aggression? Because it really does change. And I think the word purpose is really important. I like that you use that term rather than intent, because a lot of times when we think about aggressive behaviors or bites in particular, a bite is aggressing forward at something through most definitions, through a lot of definitions. And it's really about eliminating a threat. And I think oftentimes that's where some of the struggle is, because what we see as not a threat, it's not a threatening thing. So why would this animal bite in this situation? Because we don't feel that it's a threat. We forget that the dog sees it as a threat, and what the dog sees and how the dog feels is what matters in that moment as to how they're going to respond, not how we feel about the situation. The wind can blow sideways, and a dog that had no socialization and terrible things happen during their critical fear period is now thinking that that's a threat and it's something worth biting over. Whereas we look at it and we're like, nothing's going on. What's wrong? So I think a lot of miscommunication with some of these bites being landed often comes from people not understanding what the dog perceives as a threat and how to eliminate that threat appropriately.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. And we have to remember that dogs do not necessarily see, like you said, the same things that we see as threats. And we have to try to see their perception as best we can, because ultimately dogs, we love them, they're great, but they're little aliens that have been generous enough to live socially and physically with us for 35, 40,000 years. And but they don't see or hear or understand the world quite the same as we do. So what a dog perceives as a threat, when I look into a bite investigation, it doesn't matter whether that's what we would consider a valid threat. Because, for instance, it happens all the time where children get bitten in the face. There's dog size, the dogs are there. So people get upset and they go, oh, little Susie got bitten in the face. This must be a horrible dog. But if we put ourselves in the dog's position, what did they see when Susie came up? Well, what they saw was a small being that had wide eyes that were focused straight on them. They had their teeth showing. They put out their arms and made themselves larger, and then they directly approached in a straight line, making noises, and grabbed the dog around the neck. Well, all of those are dog body language signals of a potential threat from a conspecific. That dog may not have been around children and may not realize this kid does not mean or does not intend or have the purpose of being a threat. Instead, little Susie is not being watched properly by their parents, and Susie winds up getting a bite. So there's a bite, and you look at it, and sure, it looks terrible, but the dog has one time engaged with limited, moderated, and controlled force at the closest thing to their face in order to gain space. They don't have thumbs, so they can't push you away. And so, yeah, perceiving threats is a huge part of trying to analyze why a dog bit and how the dog may have perceived that action as a threat or an invasion of its personal space. So, to me, aggression has been defined, as you say, by a lot of people as behavior intended to do harm. And I think that we're deficient when we look at defining aggression as intending or even have the purpose of harm. Aggression is the cluster of behaviors that we call aggression has a couple of purposes. Number one, it's commonly used to gain space, whether it's from a conspecific or whether it's from a perceived threat, but it's used to gain space. It's another primary use is to gain access to or protect resources. And your yard is a resource, the food bowl is a resource, reproductive access is a resource. You as a person and your companionship and relationship with that dog is a resource. So some of it's protection of resource. I know there are books and people out there who break aggression into all these different categories and maternal and territorial and this. Bottom line is get space, protect resources, or protect themselves from perceived harm. And if we look at those clusters, we can see those purposes. For instance, two dogs bow up over a social dispute or access to resources. If every time two dogs had an argument, they got in a fight and they wound up injuring or killing one or both of them, the species wouldn't have lasted very long. Instead, they have the complex group of behaviors, signaling behaviors, that sometimes we pay attention to and sometimes we don't, but that has the conversation going back and forth. So that even if it goes from signaling to a fight, dispute fights between two dogs typically do very little damage, and it's a question of the dogs using that contact to decide who is more committed to the outcome here and who is willing to use that ritual combat to cede territory or resources to the other one without getting seriously hurt. So, aggression doesn't mean causing harm. There's a lot of it that's involved in posture and movement. Not as much vocalization as we do, because we don't shut up. But if we understand aggression as a way of securing basic purposes, suddenly some of these instances start making a lot more sense. In my Ph.D. work right now and in my dissertation, I'm looking at how these serious attacks happen. And I've been able to break them down based on the behavior plus the physical evidence gathered from being at the autopsies and looking at the injuries and analyzing where and how often and how hard the dogs bit and what the purpose of those bites were. I've been able to basically break fatal dog attacks and serious dog attacks into a couple of groups. We have the accidental cases where a dog does something that in a dog's mind that makes normal sense and is not a real threat addressing. The dog is grumpy, you're walking along and you reach over to pet him and he's got an ear infection you don't know about. You pet him on the ear and he turns around and it's a quick snap. There have been people who died, usually children, from that kind of thing. But the dog, there's no purpose in actually destroying the target. The dog is expressing pain or just trying, like from Susie, getting a little bit of room. Now, in one of the cases I worked, that single snap resulted in a single canine tooth piercing the carotid and jugular vessels on the child's neck, and the child bled to death. Was that a calculated attack? Not really. That's more of I'm calling them accidental. Then you have defensive, or what I call, I think what I'm calling I'm calling dog-mediated attacks, where the dog is perceived a threat, or the dog is getting space and is exercising the bite behavior to achieve that purpose, and the threat keeps coming and the dog responds to that. And then there are a group that I'm calling human mediated factors, where a person has either deliberately or unintentionally created behaviors that have encouraged or reinforced a violent response from the dog. Whether it's somebody teaching a dog to be a guard dog, or whether, and the one I love is you've got, and I hate to pick on old people because I'm getting there, but you've got the little old lady with the little Marf Marf dog in her arms, and the little Lhasa whatever is, and she's, oh, that's okay, Fluffy. Fluffy won't bite you. No, Fluffy's going to bite the crap out of you in just a minute because she has reinforced that behavior.
Yes.
And then another class that we have is cases I've worked on where actually dogs are either being used as weapons, and that does happen, or I've had several cases where dogs are being used to conceal human crimes. For instance, a child victim of sexual abuse is then thrown into an area where a chained up, unsocialized dog is, and the dog winds up biting the child, and people blow it off as a dog attack. Or
oh, it's terrible.
A situation that I worked and actually flew to the scene where the victim was actually killed by another person, but then the dogs were encouraged to engage with the dying and then dead person in order to inflict massive injuries to cover the human crime.
To make it look like it was the dogs that killed the person.
Right. And, you know, fortunately in that case, the investigators involved said, we've never done one of these before, so let's call Jim. And I flew out and assisted them with it, and yeah, we can prove it was a murder. That the dogs were secondary. One of the good things was that after some work and some evaluation, the dogs involved were not just destroyed offhand. Instead, they went into some rehabilitation and were placed.
Oh, excellent.
Because the dog's behavior was caused by a human. And without actually setting them up for that, the dogs never would have been involved.
So looking at some of these different cases and some of these reasons that these attacks are happening, what are some of the, and everybody has their own different kind of bite scale. I like to use the blend that Ian Dunbar and Sophia Yin kind of put together. But kind of, can you go into detail a little bit about what some of these bites mean, like what they look like, whether post-mortem or prior to, whenever you're investigating some of these cases, and what each of these bites kind of mean to you?
Well, like you, I've been using the Dunbar scale for a very long time, and learned about it from Ian years ago. We currently have a working group that is trying to expand and wrap in some more data into the scale. But basically the way I break it down is how hard did the dog bite? How hard did the dog have to work to get to biting? How long did the dog engage, and how many times? So we're looking at, with the things that we can quantifiably assess using the Dunbar scale or Sophia Yin scale as a base. So for instance, the levels 1 and 2, there's no contact there. That's behavior and threatening and menacing, which we should be understanding as clear message that the dog doesn't like something, or the dog wants space, or the dog, that's communication.
Yes, I was just going to point that out. You said that once, and I can't remember if it was the Lemonade Conference or the Aggression in Dogs Conference, but you said communication, and a bite is communication. So I love that you just brought that up, because what is this dog trying to communicate based on the action that it's taking? Right.
And the thing that I've found is that if the dog has to communicate using a bite, except in extremely, extremely rare situations, the dog has already tried to communicate more than a little bit in its mind before it used its teeth. That's a way of a dog raising its voice, going, hey, you're not listening. I've put my body, I've looked, I've cut my eyes, I've showed tension, I've given all these signals, and you're not listening. And you're still scaring me, or you're still not responding to what's going on here. But for instance, we go to the initial level 3 bite. That's a single bite. Okay, single bite is pretty much communication. Single bite is saying, hey, back off. And with the Dunbar scale, it's a bite that has 1 to 4 holes, half the length of a canine tooth. Why does that make sense? Well, the canines stick out above the other teeth. And a typical dog has a canine tooth that's about twice or more the length of the incisors. They have 4 canines and they have 6 incisors top and bottom. So that means that that is a moderated and controlled contact, where the dog, people don't realize canine teeth are not only used for tearing and grabbing, but they're also sensory organs. They're kind of like, I don't know about yours, but my grandparents, when I was growing up, had these little spring things that stuck out from the passenger side of the car, so that when they pulled up next to a curb, before they scraped the car on the curb, these spring things would contact the curb and make a noise. And they were called curb feelers. And in some ways, canine teeth, because they're longer and they're the first to contact, are like curb feelers for dogs. It lets them know that they've contacted something and they can moderate. That's why puppies learning bite inhibition, which is a huge thing from Dr. Dunbar's training and lots of other people, is tremendous. They have to learn to moderate that. But so a level 3 bite, you've got 1 to 4 holes, which means just the canines, so limited contact of teeth, and only half the depth of a canine tooth. I mean, we can try and parse it out more specifically, but it's really hard. Whether it's live tissue or dead tissue, getting beyond that halfway point as far as defining a third or 2/3 or whatever is almost impossible, because there's with a live victim, you have edema, swelling, the changes in the skin due to the body trying to respond to that insult to the skin and tissues. On a deceased person, even if they die right afterwards, you still have issues with skin being a plastic and malleable surface, and how much muscle and fat is it backed by. The way I use as a simple way to gauge is, if I've just got the holes, then that's a level 3. I look for the impression or pressure from the incisors to tell me whether it was more than half, because the incisors, again, tend to be about half the length. So that's when we start. Yeah. It's easier than trying to, again, even in an autopsy, sitting there with the medical examiner and putting a probe down inside a bite wound and then trying to measure that and compare it, because there's so many things that can happen with skin, especially if somebody isn't killed immediately. You've got what's called the vital reaction, which is how you tell if someone was bitten while they were alive or if those bites are post-mortem. So looking at that, so the number of holes and the depth of the holes is a real easy way to look at low-level bites. When you get up further, okay, how many times did the dog bite the person? Were those bites all low level? Well, if there's a couple of bites and they're all low level, Dr. Dunbar's added the 3B, which basically means the dog is trying to communicate, he's still holding himself back, but you really aren't listening. You're not addressing the problem. Once you get up to the level 4s where they're grabbing, then you have the question of grab and pressure injuries, of shaking and pulling, and that the purpose of that bite is typically very different from the purpose of a single engage and release. If the dog's grabbing onto you and shaking and pulling, its purpose is not just to drive you away. There's something else going on there that we need to look at. By the time you get to a 5, you have multiple serious bites where you have pressure and slashing and tearing, and you have avulsion, or the removal of tissue, and that's a truly dangerous situation. And in some cases now, the only difference between that and a fatality is where you are and what your community resources for medical care are. You know, if you live in a place that has a rescue squad that can get to you quickly and somebody sees you, then you may well survive a very serious attack. If you're out in the country and something like that happens to you, you're at great risk for death from that kind of an attack. And since those are a different purpose, those tend to be very rare. Those are more predatory. Dogs are omnivores, but they do have and show what's called the predatory motor sequence. And that's something that we all see in all of our dogs. It starts with the eye, when that dog's looking and sees a target. Then there's a stalk where the dog creeps up. What is that? Border collie. Eye and stalk.
That's right.
And then there is a chase. Still border collie. Or any other dog, but especially herding dogs. But we've bred them to stop there, because the next step is typically a disabling bite. And then there is a kill bite. And that kill bite is usually that grab, hold, shake, and tear. With a small animal, that is designed so that the dog, if it's going after prey, picks up the small animal, shakes it, breaks the neck, and then carries it back home. With a larger animal, they go in, and the idea is to disable that animal as quickly as possible, but then to attack in such a way, often to the abdomen, so that, if you're a wild canid of whatever kind, there's probably also something in the neighborhood that's bigger than and badder than you. Bears. Or whatever. Lions, tigers, bears, whatever. So if you go for the high value, high caloric internal organs first, you get the good parts for survival, and then you can leave the chicken wings for everybody else. And then canids, and our dogs too, will dissect, and they will also carry stuff back to their den. My guys pick up their toys and carry them back into their crates and chew on them and all that all the time. That's part of that behavior sequence. But when that behavior sequence becomes closer to its full fulfillment, that's when we start getting really dangerous stuff happening.
And where do you see that line between that semi-inhibited or inhibited bite and that completely disinhibited bite, where you go from controlled to uncontrolled?
That's where the basic criteria that I look at come together. How hard the dog bite, how hard and how much did the dog have to do to work to, how much did it persevere? How much did it have to work at in order to make that bite happen the way it did? How many times did the dog bite? Those, basically force, frequency, and persistence. How did this dog bite once and back up, or did it chew its way through the door and then come after the target? What was how much driving force was there to inflict the bite? Again, a quick bite to somebody walking by may mean, okay, it's shallow, it's a single bite, so it's inhibited, it's controlled because the dog just nails the closest target to it. That's communication. That's a dog trying to get space. But the dog that has to work much harder, whether it's going through a barrier, whether it's chasing somebody down and pursuing and then engaging on multiple bites, that steps the severity of it up. I worked a case on a fatality in another country where the victim was killed by her own dog. A visitor came in, the dog went off and targeted the visitor. The owner of the dog told the visitor to go hide literally in the laundry room. The dog was so motivated that it actually bit chunks in the door of the laundry room where the guest was hiding. But the level of arousal and frustration became so high that the dog turned and had to direct that somewhere. The owner was physically unable to totally control him, and the dog wound up taking the owner out. Well, that, right off that sound, and it was really bad and really tragic. But that's where investigation comes in, because what I was able to find out was this same dog, same house, same victim, there were drugs involved at the house. Twice before, bad guys had invaded the home armed and assaulted and gone after the owner. And both times the dog placed itself between the bad guys and the resident there, his owner. In one case, bit and chased the bad guys out despite the fact that its ear got blown off by a shotgun blast. In the other case, the bad guys retreated and the dog went out through the front window and turned the primary bad guy into a really nasty pile of damaged flesh outside. So the background of that dog told us a lot about why the dog did what it did. It had been encouraged to be protective and human aggressive, and it had a history of having to defend the owner. So in that case, its purpose was defensive. It went too far, and it chose somebody who wasn't a valid threat. But to the dog, he perceived that visitor as a threat. It was somebody who hadn't been there before. It was an odd time of day, and the circumstances were not normal. So, the escalation or put it this way, when you get a really serious case, once we dig into it, we tend to find that there are lower level cases that preceded that. Again, in the dog's mind, that behavior fulfilled the purpose that the dog was looking at achieving in those lower level cases. Not all dogs escalate, but then not everybody, for instance, that is mean as a child and pulls a cat's tail winds up graduating to be a serial killer.
Right.
But some of them do.
That's true. Well, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the whys. So from a behavior perspective, in a lot of these different cases that you've seen and been a part of, what are some of those reasons that you've come across leading up to these events from the dog's perspective, per se, as much as we can try to think from a dog's perspective, have been some of those whys? What are the reasons that these things are happening from your experience?
Some of them wind up being defensive incidences where it goes beyond what normal, what we would usually call a normal response would be. To go back to the ritual combat between dogs, usually what happens is one dog gets to the point where it decides that the ultimate purpose is not worth getting hurt or getting killed, so it retreats. In defensive situations, you push, I don't care whether it's a dog or a bunny rabbit, into a corner and threaten it, it may well decide to defend itself. Most of the time, defense involves doing just enough damage to basically open the exit door and find a place to run away. It goes back to the old fight, flee, or freeze response to danger. An animal can freeze like a bunny rabbit in the middle of the highway. Well, that presumes that the animal hasn't been seen, and that animal is trying to blend in and not be seen. Once it's been seen, it has two choices: fight or flee. Animals for survival will typically choose to run away. Run away and live to fight another day. Usually a fight involves one of the two animals either giving up and saying, "I'm done," or getting enough of enough space to run away and disengage and go home and lick its wounds. I do believe and have seen that there are some dogs out there, and I don't believe that it's restricted to a single breed, that for whatever reason in their brain, they don't seem to have that disengagement switch. They get so aroused, and what Dr. Mills and several of your other researchers go back to calling frustration. They become so aroused and focused on a particular goal that they don't de-escalate as the threat abates, but they continue. And so, that escalates the situation into a much, much more serious thing. But, for most cases, defensive behavior, once the dog is able to either drive back or find a way to run away, that usually stops it. But some dogs, again, don't seem to recognize that, or don't have that ability. And there's speculation that's actually a neurotransmitter deficit. If it's not trained, like somebody who's got a Schutzhund dog or a police or military dog that has been taught to keep going as long as it's commanded to, it seems that there may be a neurotransmitter deficit in basically the off circuit in the canine brain. So that defensive issues like that come up. Now there are some that I've seen that are predatory, where the animals, sometimes due to nutritional issues and sometimes not, actually go through the predatory sequence. And as an example, I had a case where an older gentleman went out to check his mail, and there were a pair of dogs, large dogs, that were allowed by their owners to roam the neighborhood. Apparently they were not appropriately fed, because on necropsy of both of the dogs, we found scavenged garbage from discarded food from people's garbage cans that they'd been into. But this gentleman was out getting his mail. The dogs came around and targeted him. They took him to the ground. He tried to fight them off. They dragged him 70 or 80 feet up a hill into their yard. And when his wife drove up, the attack was still ongoing, and they had eaten him from the knees down.
Oh, wow.
And he, unfortunately, he lived that long, where he expired just after she got there. Again, on necropsy, we found a couple of kilograms of leg tissue in both of the dogs' stomachs. So that was a predatory attack. And those dogs had been allowed to roam, had never been controlled. And again, we found also in their stomach, we found a full package of raw hot dogs that had been chomped down just like in 1 or 2 bites. And we found leavings of steak from somebody's dinner and some other detritus from garbage cans. So those dogs were operating at least partially under nutritional constraints. In that case, there was more going on, because we also, when I went with the investigators to the home where the dogs came from, we found 35 other dogs kept in undersized crates hidden in the backyard.
Oh my, yeah.
So it was a fatal dog attack, but the people were also hoarding and breeding dogs and keeping them in highly substandard conditions. So like my friend and basically mentor, Randy Lockwood, said once a long time ago in regard to the Diane Whipple case, it was, and the phrase has been overused since, but it's a perfect storm, really, of characteristics that come together when something that massive happens. And, I had a child, similar situation, went by a home, was walking home. One of the dogs in the yard that were not contained spooked him. He ran, which was a bad idea.
Yeah.
The dogs took him down, dragged him into the yard, and then consumed a significant portion of his body. And there was a nutritional component to that as far as the dog's physical condition, and there were 6 of them. And there were some other neglect factors that involved that we were able to put together a picture, both from the dogs and the wounds, and also going out, and they held the crime scene, and I was actually able to find in the road in front of the house where the child's footprints went from walking footprints to running footprints to scuffing in the dirt and blood stains and the drag marks back to where the body was recovered. So we were able to use the physical evidence to put together a really good picture of what happened, and we sent the owner to prison.
Good. And this is where it always comes to mind. I mean, I've been working with pit bull type dogs and rescues and dogfight dogs for a very, very long time. And so anytime someone says to me, oh, this is horrible, these dogs are terrible, it always stems back to the humans, how the humans are involved, the irresponsibility factor on the side of the human owners, because ultimately we've created these dependents, and when we're not fulfilling their needs, we're creating these perfect storms, as you say. We're the ones that are driving these very, very dangerous behaviors, and I think that's often very difficult for people to separate. They immediately blame the dogs. The dogs are vicious, the dogs are monsters, the dogs are just innately terrible. Think about what happens the step prior to these dog attacks, to these fatal attacks in particular. It is always human driven. It's such a very odd rarity to have an animal that's so genetically off that they just want to run out and kill things. Like, it just doesn't happen like that.
And I would liken it to humans. Within humans, I mean, I think our percentage-wise, we're probably way higher than dogs, but we do have our Jeffrey Dahmers and Ted Bundys and this moron that shot up the grocery store in Aurora, Colorado, and people that are so improperly wired that they do horrible things. And I've seen a couple of dogs, out of all the thousands of dogs, a couple of them that were just basically psycho. How did they get there? In the couple of cases, there have been iffy welfare issues, but there's also had to have been something else, and we don't necessarily know because we don't always have a history. But that's one of the things that I find valuable and interesting in investigating these is, okay, we've got an incident, but how did we get here? Why did this incident happen? To begin with, I want to know, okay, this happened right now. What happened 5 seconds before the bite? What happened 10 seconds? What happened 30 seconds? What happened an hour before? What happened a week before? What has been the additive factors that have come together? Has this been a behavior that's been tolerated or encouraged? Has this been a behavior that's been successful in the past, and today it went further than it had in the past? And whether that's with fatal or serious bites, or just simply a regular biting dog. In rehabbing, I have some Kevlar protective gear, and a young dog, about 8 months old, that a client had learned. When they called me, they said they'd been working on it. The dog was only biting them about 8 times a day. But the dog had learned that this behavior made it possible for them to manipulate their environment. And they got what they wanted.
Yep.
So I threw my Kevlar pants on and took the dog on the leash, and wearing the protective gear and the boots, stood there. And the dog goes, and bit and bit and bit and bit, and I just stood there.
Yeah.
And finally, the dog's rah, 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 and looks up, and nothing's happening. And rah, huh? And it's like, okay, are you done? Sit.
That's right.
Dog plops down. Dog gets cookie. Oh my God, I've been doing this wrong the whole time. You know, it wasn't a magic fix, but by starting the intervention by being able to safely have the dog be unsuccessful in what it wanted, and then being able to replace that misplaced behavior with something that got the dog more of what it wanted, we were able to start the dog down the path towards rehabilitation and understanding the difference. Was that a mean dog? No. Just somewhere early in its life, it had learned that this was a successful behavior.
This works.
And so, was the dog dangerous? In its current state, yeah. Had it been exposed to people that were not prepared for that, or young kids, it could have done a lot of damage. But was it really a dog that needed to be destroyed because it was unredeemable? In that case, no. You know, it doesn't always work out that way. But like yourself, I've worked with quite a number of fighting dogs. And for instance, we had the 21 dogs that came out of Ontario a few years back. Those were my dogs. And we got them out of Ontario, put them in rehab. And of those 21, there were 2 that I refused to take. 6 of them are now working in law enforcement as detector dogs. 2 of them are bona fide service dogs.
I love it.
And other than one dog wound up in permanent sanctuary, 1 dog wound up having medical conditions, and the rest of them have been successfully placed and living in family situations after rehab for 2 years now.
Excellent. Yeah.
So we have to, you know, even reinforced dog combative violent behavior, like fighting dogs, who have been typically abused to encourage them to be as violent as possible towards other dogs, even that aggression can sometimes be moderated and controlled, or replaced with more acceptable and safer behavior.
Well, and the one thing I always love to talk to people about, especially when it comes to dogs that are potentially aggressive towards other dogs, is that it doesn't have any bearing on whether they'll be aggressive towards people at all. And we're so used to the human way, where if you're a human and you're aggressive to another species, you're likely to be aggressive to the same species or any species really. Whereas in the dog world, those things can be very independent of one another and very separate from one another.
Yeah. Well, look at fighting dogs, professional level fighting dogs. In a and I hate to use the word professional, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean.
In a formal dog fight, you've got a 16-foot square plywood enclosed area where the 2 dogs are put at each other from opposite corners. In that space, you have 3 human beings.
Yes.
You have 1 handler for each of the dogs, and you have a judge.
Yep.
You know, now, dogfighting judge is not something I've ever aspired to be, but you put the 2 dogs together and they're extremely violent. But if either of those dogs redirects to a human target, being the handlers or the judge, typically they're shot on the spot.
Yep.
Because even those horrible, nasty people who are using these dogs for blood sport and maiming and killing each other, they don't want to get bitten. So they're selecting dogs that are very reactive to conspecifics, to other dogs, but are not human aggressive. So, you know, one does not necessarily mean the other.
Now, it's interesting we bring that part up about too, with dog fighters not tolerating a redirect or a displacement of aggression. Where's your line? I mean, I'm sure you've probably been in this position before too, as far as consulting what to do with a situation where you have a dog that doesn't disengage, that has that really high arousal level to where they're fine 95% of the time, but that's that 5% if you get too close to that ball or, you know, something triggers the dog, that they have a very difficult time de-escalating. Where's kind of your line with that?
It's got to go case by case. A lot of it depends on the conditions and the responsibility of the people that are involved in managing and controlling that animal, and also how severe it is. Is this a dog that we can, for instance, intervene and teach to release on command, so that we can put in that safety switch there? Or is this a dog that is too focused, and that we have to remember that, you know, whether it's a shelter or individuals, we all have different levels of resources and knowledge and abilities. So for instance, if the dogs from Canada got lucky, they wound up being overseen by someone who had a lot of money and resources to throw at them. We were able to do extensive rehabilitation, and we were able to very, very particularly and specifically choose where those dogs went. Understanding that, okay, even though everything is going perfectly, you always have to keep in the back of your mind that there could be an accident. Something could happen, so they have to be managed. So, you know, placing dogs that have that high of dog-dog drive can be really iffy. And there's lots of places, and I don't hold it against them, they don't have the resources to do that. So the safest thing for the public, and we have to keep that in our sights, is that this dog may not be appropriate for ever being placed.
Right.
It just may not work out. The dog doesn't have the skills or the ability to do that, and we don't have the resources. Some dogs, sadly, have been broken by people, and we can't just fix them. Other times we've got lower levels of issues, or we happen to have resources, but it's an excellent point. I've had a case where, like so many of them, a child was unsupervised. But this particular dog was chained. Okay, 2 warnings here. Unsupervised child,
And
chained
chain.
dog.
Yes.
That had a favorite ball and toy. And most of the time, the adults in the household supervised the child and the dog together, and they let the child throw the ball for the dog, and the dog just loved it and was very, very excitable and very focused on that toy. Until the day that, due to some problems within a household, the 2-year-old child got outside by himself and wound up wandering within the area the dog was chained with the toy, probably in his hand or up by his face. The dog went after the toy. We know he went after the toy. The ball was torn up. Part of it was in his stomach. We recovered it on necropsy. And we know the dog was highly focused on that. But that's one of those horrible accidents where the dog, based on the injuries and evidence and so forth, the dog probably went after the ball and connected with the child at the same time.
Yeah.
And once the ball's involved and the child's involved and everything is going sideways at the same time, the child wound up losing his life. So yeah, that kind of focus we have to be careful with, and that kind of and again, if it's dog focus, we've got to be really careful that that's not somebody who's going to take their, and again, regardless of breed, going to take their big dog out that's got horrible dog focus like that and walk them on a flexi leash.
Yeah.
Because when they see the neighbor's little white fluffy marf coming by, that's a disaster just waiting to happen. And, so many people, either they don't pay attention or they drop something, or in a case of a flexi leash, the mechanical device
Snaps.
fails, which
Yep.
they do. Then what have you got? You've got a plastic handle with a dog on a shoestring that's 10 meters long. That's not control. Here in Jacksonville, Florida, for instance, if a dog does something and bites somebody and it's on a flexi leash, our animal control prosecute it as a dog running at large. We don't
We need that up
recognize a
here.
flexi leash.
We need that in North
we don't
Carolina.
recognize a flexi as being under control.
No, I would
because
agree
it's
with that
not.
100%. Yeah. Well, let me ask you this too. So for people that end up, I would like to just briefly touch, because I don't want to take your entire day up, but briefly touch on both de-escalation and prevention. So, there's a lot of information about preventing dog bites, but as far as de-escalation goes, what happens when your rescuer, your foster, your pet parent, your trainer finds themselves in a position with a dog that is not coming down well, that has that high arousal? This could potentially be a dangerous situation. What's your best bet? If the human is saying, I'm done and I'm not fighting, one of the things that I always talk to owners about is don't scream. It's one of the worst things you can do.
Right.
Stop screaming. Don't run.
And don't run.
Don't run. But what are some other de-escalating tricks that you might have based on some of the things that you've seen in your experience?
Well, we can look at the same things the dogs do to de-escalate conflict between themselves. For instance, two dogs facing each other frontally is a challenge. So, for instance, I authored what's now approved by the Department of Justice as the nationwide course for police encounters with dogs and calls so they can stop shooting them.
Yes.
And I teach them, turn your body to an angle, because an angled body posture tells the dog, I don't want to tangle with you. Watch dog-dog conflicts and slow them down on video, and you can see a lot of this. Or look up, for instance, the body language explanations that, for instance, Roger Abrantes has written in his books over the years. Or look at the calming signals that Tura Rugas, and I can never remember if she's in Sweden or Norway, but the book is Calming Signals on Talking Terms with Dogs. Look at the body language. I teach the officers, if the dog is coming out and you're going to have to, you can't simply close the gate, turn your body to the side. Don't look the dog in the eye. Smile, but don't show your teeth, so you soften your face. Pick up the cues that the dog understands to tell the dog, I'm not a threat, I don't want to engage. The dog is probably reacting to something that you did that it perceives as either a threat or impinging upon its space or whatever. So use the dog's own body language. I tell people I can speak dog with an accent because I can't move my ears real well, and my tail we don't want to talk about. But use those body postures. If the dog comes for you and is charging you, typically it's trying to say, you're somewhere you don't belong. So you can move your body posture, you can look away, you can stop advancing, and you can send a message to the dog that you want to de-escalate the situation. It feels silly the first time you do it, but you can actually turn your head and yawn. Mm-hmm. That is a signal that a dog recognizes as a de-escalation signal. You can sit there, and with mustache it's harder, but you can lick your lips. Again, we feel silly, but it's using those kind of signals that has allowed me to go into secure kennels and whatever and actually get my hands on and build at least a short-term relationship of trust with about 60 dogs that have killed human beings after they did so. These are dogs I know are fully capable of ripping somebody's throat out because I've got the pictures.
Right.
And I'm there to try to figure out, I'm not there to try to figure out if this dog can be placed. I tell people, I'm not here to save the dog. I'm here to figure out what happened.
Right.
And is there a human component, mostly? And can we hold somebody responsible for this because somebody lost their life? You know, what can we put together to hold anybody that's responsible, but also to learn from it so we can tell people what not to do. And what not to do is, it wasn't a fatal, but I had a legal case where a guy goes to a party, the dog's on the other side on a leash with its owner, starts barking at him. He goes, "Oh dude, I'm like a dog whisperer." And he walks across the backyard, approaches the dog, even though the dog is barking and warning, even though the owner is saying, "Yo, you probably don't want to say hello to the dog," reaches over, grabs the dog by the side of the face and puts his face in the dog's nose because that's what dog whisperers do, man. And of course the dog proceeded to take off a large part of his nose. Single bite, fully understandable. And as far as I'm concerned, the victim bought and paid for that one.
Yeah.
The dog tried communicating. But in a case where we've got something that's already going sideways, de-escalate. Make yourself less threatening. Understand the dog's communication and look for those. I mean, I've had dogs where, you know, they're on one side of the fence and they're going crazy trying to eat me, and I'm moving my body and looking away, and it's such a rush when the dog is acting like a fool, and I'm either holding my position or I may even turn my, you know, in that case, because there's a barrier, turn my back on the dog. Mm-hmm. But once the communication, the conversation starts, the dog is tense and they're tight and they're looking at me with the hard eyes, and I see that first, just that diversion of the eyes, 5 degrees and a lick. I'm starting to communicate, and I can return similar signals. And it's such a rush to watch the level of arousal drop and that trust start to come up. You know, I'm not going to take this dog home, but I can use body language and positioning to communicate in dog with the dog, coupled with, you know, not showing body tension, not yelling, keeping my voice down. A lot of things where we go from confrontation to negotiation is the way I put it.
It's a great way to put it. Yeah.
If we learn dog language, and if we learn to see the warning signs before it becomes critical, then it's very possible we can negotiate with the dog. Because negotiation is 2 big things. Number 1, negotiation requires communication. You don't negotiate with somebody by yelling at them and jumping up and down and threatening them and hitting them about the head with rolled up newspaper or a stick or whatever. That's not communicating. So first we have to communicate, which means we both have to give and take, and we both have to speak the same language. And no, communicating with a dog is not whispering. It's not ESP. It's not only for special people. Any of us can do it. It's an easy language to learn. We recognize most of it. We just have to put it into place. So the first step is communication, and then the second step in negotiation is, I have something you want, you have something I want. It's in both of our interests to meet both of those sets of wants or needs. So dogs we are really lucky with. I don't have any experience with elephants or tigers or lions, you know, so I don't know what they want. But we're lucky because dogs are what we call affiliative and gregarious. They like being in groups, and they like associating with human beings. So I've already got something we can feed off of each other with. I can give you attention, you can give me attention. We can both have a nice warm fuzzy feeling, and that's a great place to start our conversation. I can provide food. I can provide treats. I can provide toys. I can provide that social contact. So by looking at the things that a dog wants and needs, I can put it in a situation, we can place ourselves in a situation where we can provide what they need, and in return, all we ask from them is to trust us, to communicate with us, and we can both have a rewarding interaction. And by doing that, I run into these people, sadly, all the time, that they go, oh yeah, I deal with aggressive dogs all the time. See the scars? Okay. I'm not impressed. I've been bitten, and every time I've been bitten, it's my fault. I screwed up. Every time I've been bitten, except for one during Hurricane Katrina, where a volunteer got in the way and I took the bite instead of letting the dog bite them. Long story. Iffy dog. If they had followed my directions, it wouldn't have happened. But I could protect myself, or I could protect the volunteer who didn't belong there in the first place. And I wound up taking the bite. And,
hopefully that was a lesson learned for the volunteer, at least.
Yeah, especially when I kicked them in. While I'm holding the dog, I kicked them in the middle of the chest, and they flew across the room. And I told them if I ever saw them in New Orleans again, I was going to personally drown them in Lake Pontchartrain. And
that's
they
the
never
cop
came
coming
back.
After you.
Well, it was kind of wild and woolly there, and it was just us and the military, and I'm sure lots of things happened that weren't by the book. But in any case, it's. I preach to the police officers, and being an old police officer myself, I understand the mindset. But when we're dealing with the dogs, it's negotiation, not domination.
Yes.
Dominance, throw all that crap out, please.
That's not going to work. Yeah,
and that's a whole other conversation. Mm-hmm. But we want to negotiate, not dictate. So even when we're working as trainers or whatever with a dog that has problems, we can usually find common ground so that we can conduct a negotiation so that even for a short period, our relationship is based on mutual trust. If I'm talking to the dog, I'm not going to hurt you, and you don't hurt me. I'm not going to let you drive me away. I'm going to continue with what I'm doing as long as your reactions stay within certain bounds. But if your reactions stay within those bounds, I'm going to give to you. I'm going to help you meet your needs and desires. And like I said, in almost 60 dogs that have done horrible things to people, there were 2 of them that I refused to even deal with because those were the Jeffrey Dahmers. Everybody else, and it doesn't happen. It's not quick. I mean, I may sit literally in front of a kennel with my back to the fence on the floor for an hour while the dog is going stupid until I finally get that one break where I can start to make the connection. And once I start, and like I say, it's really a rush for both of us to get that connection. Here you have a dog that has some real problems and whose needs have not been met. And, it's very rewarding for the dog to be able to go, oh, okay, I can trust you. I can interact with you. I don't have to lose my mind anymore. Can you scratch right here? and that's a wonderful feeling. it would be great if we could magically transfer that so the dog would do that with everybody. Sadly, a lot of these dogs are way too damaged. But at least, and it sounds strange, but that's why there have been times where I've said, okay, the dog and I are getting along, we're doing fine, based on my experience and training. I'll actually sit down with the dog and at least give them the sedation if they're going to be destroyed right there, so that no matter how bad their life has been, their last few moments are with somebody that they at least for a moment can trust and can have a connection with.
That's wonderful.
Like I said, the bottom line is negotiate. Learn to, you can read, you can look at a zillion and 52 videos on YouTube or whatever of dog interactions and dogs interacting with humans and bites. Learn the signals, and even if you feel silly, try to use those signals to connect with the dog and build that level of trust. I've worked with plenty of dogs that have had serious problems, and sometimes it's hard to make the transition, and that's why I when people have serious problems, I don't recommend boot camps where you send the dog away and then get it back, because as a trainer, if I haven't taught you what to do, it doesn't matter whether I can handle the dog. That's not the issue at hand. But again, use those skills and that language to negotiate with the dog.
Well, and I like that you're mentioning everything about what to do for the dog and what the dog wants and kind of what the dog needs as far as communication goes. And to piggyback off of that, I like to think about what they don't want as well. We talked earlier about eliminating threats and having purpose behind these aggressive tendencies, the warning bites, to give the dog space. As humans, we can very easily communicate what consent means. I don't want you touching me. I don't want you in my space. Yet, when we look at another species like a dog, we go into their space whether they want it or not. That dog doesn't want to be manipulated, but we're going to manipulate them because it's us first. So if everyone can kind of take a step back and say, would I like it if someone came into my space and just told me that they were going to touch me whether I liked it or not, or they were going to manipulate me whether I liked it or not? How would you feel about that? And not that we want to anthropomorphize, but to put a human emotion on it so that humans can understand, perhaps from the dog's perspective, what they also don't want potentially, and how we're kind of abusing our privilege as humans to just kind of take over that space whether they want us to or not.
Yeah, and learning to recognize the signals that the dogs use to tell us that. Learning to recognize those early communication steps. You come towards the dog and the dog is feeling grumpy that day, whether it's your dog or another dog, and the dog looks at you and keeps looking away. It's talking to you. It's trying to tell you, I'm not really up for a cuddle today. The dog licking its lips or yawning or looking and seeing that the dog's pupils have gone from normal for the light to suddenly they're highly dilated. That's a physiological sign of a change in their emotional state. They are becoming either fearful or excited, or something is happening. But if you're sitting there and the dog's pupils are normal and you do something, that's one of the early signs. Tension. Is the dog's mouth open like the typical yellow lab, or is it tight? Is it closed? Is it drawn tighter at the edges? Are you starting to see teeth? All of those things are things that we need to learn to recognize and honor and say, okay, I don't know why, but right now you seem to have something going on where you're not comfortable. So the best thing I can do is change the situation. If a dog is sitting, if one of my dogs is sitting over there and feeling uncomfortable, and it's clear, if I need to do something with the dog, then fine. I set myself up to bring the dog to me and to reinforce that positive response rather than violating their space and making them more uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's something I tell my kids all the time. You can either make this situation better or you can make this situation worse. But think about what you're going to do first and which direction that's going to take things.
Yeah, and I have to look back. You know, my parents were, we had dogs growing up, but they were average dog owners. I mean, you know, for the time. It's, you know, they weren't sophisticated dog owners. But even at that time growing up, if as a kid you got bitten by the neighborhood dog or whatever, the first thing your parents did was, all right, what'd you do to deserve that?
That's right.
Not,
what'd you do?
Oh my God, there's a dangerous dog. It's, what did you do? You did something. And I want to find out what it is because we're going to make sure you understand, don't ever do that again or I'll kick your butt.
That's right.
And, you know, so we need to in order to honor a dog's ability to make choices, which I think is very important. We need to recognize when they're trying to tell us what their choice is. And, you know, there's an awful lot about the force-free and never aversive and whatever. Okay, force-free is great because, you know, not forcing another organism to do something is really the crux of what we should be doing with each other too.
Yes.
We should not. And, you know, people say, well, I'm going to show the dog's in charge. No, what you're going to show is that you're a bully.
Yes, exactly.
And what you don't realize is and I learned this through years as a police officer, and it applies out on the street as police, it applies when we're dealing with dogs. There is always, and this was an old officer that told me, there's always somebody out there who's bigger, badder, or has less to lose than you do.
Yes.
So you cannot win fighting all the time. Your mouth can do a lot more than your fists can do. Because if you, and if you look at some of the videos and current events in various situations, and I'm not picking on either group, but you can look and you can see that when one group starts to apply force to another group, it's very common for the opposite group to apply force back. And it works with individuals. If I walked up to somebody and said, Charlie, look, there's a warrant out for you. We've been through this 14 times before. Come on, let's get in the car. More often, Charlie would go, all right, Officer Crosby, let's go. In fact, if you can get me down before, literally, if you can get me down before noon, I can call my probation officer and he'll have me out for dinner. Great. But if I walked up to the same guy and bounced him, like an episode of Chicago PD or something on TV, he's going to come off the wall bent out of shape, justifiably, and he's going to give force back. So when we look at dogs, you get a 60 or 70 or 100-pound dog that's truly pissed off, he's going to kick your butt.
Yep.
You cannot dominate that dog because if it is either frightened enough or has an attitude where it feels like it has nothing left to lose, you're gonna lose. So applying force is just a way of bullying. Compliance does not mean cooperation. And again, from my years as a policeman, if I say, move it now or you're going to jail, and the person walks off, okay, that's compliance, but they're not cooperating with me. They're acting because they recognize a consequence that they don't want to deal with.
That's right.
So, you know, if you're one of these people who your dog doesn't sit fast enough, so you snatch the lead up and strangle them, it may comply, but that's not a partnership. That's not cooperation. That's compliance to avoid something painful or scary. So, that's very important. Now, I think we fail to delineate sometimes the difference between that and the fact that there are aversives in life. And we can go to great length to define, well, what's aversive to whom or whatever. Aversive is just something we don't like. So if my little Jack Russell mix, Pete, who is a jerk, because he's a Jack Russell, is out on a leash and sees another dog that he decides he doesn't like and starts barking and lunging at him, and I tell him, sit right here. Well, I'm not letting him do what he wants to because he wants to go over and be a jerk. So that's technically aversive. Am I punishing him? No, I'm redirecting his behavior to something that is not quite what he wants, but is going to keep him out of trouble. If your child is running for the stove and the burner's on, putting their hands up, you may yell, don't you do that. Get back here, you're going to burn yourself. And that may be aversive to the child because mommy just yelled at him, but you really don't feel like a trip to the emergency room.
Yeah, that's a harder way to learn. That's a much more aversive way to learn by putting your hand on.
Yeah, instead of necessarily worrying about, is this aversive, let's look at it and say, okay, am I communicating? Am I trying to guide the animal into something that we can agree upon, or am I being a bully? And to some extent, if I don't let you chase cars and you want to, yeah, that may be unpleasant for you, but it's because I don't want you flattened by the Buick down the street. And so I'm going to be knowingly somewhat aversive, but I love the thing that IAABC and CCPDT and a lot of organizations have come with is we use the least invasive, minimally aversive technique, especially when it comes to making life-saving decisions with the dog. Mm-hmm. We're going to be the least invasive, so we're just like a doctor. If I can give you antibiotics or do open abdominal surgery, I want to try the antibiotics first. Yes. Because there's less of a chance of it going sideways and it's going to be less unpleasant for you. And minimally aversive, well, I may not let you get away with everything forever, but I'm going to make the alternative as acceptable and cooperative with you as possible so that we can avoid unnecessary bad situations, and we can avoid me being a bully, because those old ways, we've changed. And again, as we were talking before we started recording, years ago when I started, I actually used electronic collars until I learned better, because I learned the science and I learned to put myself in the dog's shoes. And the last few years that I used them in competition, I did not use the impulses at all. What I actually used, and I still think there are, if you could remove the shock part of it, I conditioned my dogs so that if they did something, I blew the whistle and they sat 500 yards away, I could hit the button for the tone only that I had conditioned as a secondary reinforcer. So I was able to reach out 400 or 500 yards and go, good dog.
Yes.
It was like a really long-range clicker. So, the thing is we need to work on if we understand the behaviors and we understand the welfare and we understand the needs, then we can use that positioning to avoid being bullies, to avoid beating up on our dogs, and to meet their needs, and to develop that partnership that to me is the essence of why we and dogs have been hanging out for 40,000 years. They're not only useful, for instance, as hunter-gatherers in finding prey or something, but we haven't done that for a long time, and we still keep them around, and they still tolerate us. So there's that companionship that's built up that we need to honor and try to build on.
The mutual part to a mutual relationship. Yep.
Yeah, and don't violate that trust.
Absolutely, for sure. And I think that starting with some of the mistakes that we make with dogs can really help us better understand why some of these things happen. What is the purpose behind these bites that occur, these attacks that occur, fatal or non-fatal, but it gives us so much more information when we try to understand it from the dog's perspective and really try to use communication tools that they're understanding of as well, that don't really hinder that trust, that don't, that isn't forceful to where we're pushing them in a position that they don't necessarily want to be in, but rather cultivating that mutualistic, beneficial relationship both ways between dog and human.
Yeah, I think that if one of the ways we could reduce dog bites over the spectrum is simply to pay attention and to understand the communication that should be going back and forth. Because, and just the other day I made I responded, what's the old thing? Oh yeah, let me do something constructive. Let me argue with somebody on the internet. But, they were saying that, the old thing about, well, the dog just snapped.
Yes.
No.
I hate that line.
The dog didn't just snap. Something well, the dog didn't give any warning. Yeah, on a few cases, every once in a while, there are dogs that, for instance, have been punished for giving warning. The old thing, don't punish the growl.
That's right.
They have been punished for warning. And so it happens once in a while. But typically, no, the dog has tried to warn you, and you were just either unknowledgeable, not paying attention, or deliberately blowing it off when the dog tried to talk to you before the bite. There's a great video online, and you can find it if you look. A few years back, they're in Denver at the TV station there. They had and I don't know where she is now, they had an anchor by the name of Kyle Dwyer.
Ah, yes.
And the setup for the situation was the day before, this large dog, a Dogo Argentino, had gotten out on the ice, and the firemen had gone out and saved him from falling through the ice and so forth. Great story. The dog was safe. The next morning, Kyle had the owner and the dog with her on the set. Great human interest story. Everything is wonderful. And suddenly, the dog bites her right in the face. Well, if you go through that video, especially if you slow it down, what you see is a dog that, number one, is already anxious. You've got a dog that's never been in a TV studio, and if you've ever been in front of the camera, you know that there's a lot of crap going on just out of sight. There's big cameras, there's hot lights, there's noise, there's wires, there's people running around with headsets. It's chaotic off that little piece that you're seeing. So the dog's already anxious. The dog is letting her pet, but she decides to do, for good TV, give the dog a kiss at the end of the interview. And you watch the video, and especially I've slowed it down for students, the dog leans back, he looks away, he's already licked a couple of times, he bares his teeth, and then he engages as she continues. Now, it's over a short period of time. I really believe that sometimes dogs think we're their slow relative because they communicate very quickly back and forth.
Yes.
Slow down some videos of dogs interacting and watch the signals going back and forth. It's amazing. So I think they think we're a little slow. But
Probably.
and it was cool because she's a dog person, and she recognized she would not cooperate with any action against the dog because she recognized she bought and paid for that.
Yes.
That she should have seen those signals. The owner should have probably also seen the dog getting, because you could see the dog tensing and went through a lot of those signals that, again, if you look at either Turid Rugas's book or Dr. Kendall Shepard over in the UK, who's a friend, she has something called the ladder of aggression.
Yes.
And it goes through some of the things that you see the escalation of discomfort covering. And people misunderstand it. It doesn't mean you necessarily hit all the rungs of the ladder. You may hit 1 and 2 and 5 and 9, depending on the dog. But if you look at that video, and again, it's up online, you can see, especially as you slow it down, the dog going through the communication repertoire saying, I'm uncomfortable, I'm not happy here, and you're violating my space, and you're ignoring what I'm saying, and so you're going to get bit. So, if we just taught people to pay more attention and to understand those signals, and then to understand that if you're getting the signals, figure out why your dog is uncomfortable and try to fix the problem instead of overreacting or continuing with what you're doing. Think about it just like you'd think about if somebody was making you uncomfortable. I mean, today we see people are finally coming up where if you watch something like Mad Men or whatever on TV, you've got men leaning over secretaries and acting inappropriate and invading women's spaces and so forth. And at that time in that place, those women were unable to express their discomfort. Now we've learned, well, dogs, I'm not equating women and dogs, but what I'm saying is that as organisms, as sentient beings, dogs will give us feedback and will communicate to us. And you're right, we probably, in fact, it's much better not to be forcing our dogs to suffer needlessly, but instead let's build that relationship and that communication. And if we just pay attention to that, like I said, even the most serious fatal attacks, if people were paying attention, at least some of those would be avoidable. And as we go down, there's about 4.5 million people a year in the U.S. bitten every year, and very few of those need hospitalization. But if out of those 4.5 million people, we got even 1 million people to start pulling their head out of the sand and paying attention, that's 1 million people and 1 million dogs that we could avoid, having those negative situations. And in a lot of cases, those are dogs that would not be wind up being either surrendered to shelters or given up on or destroyed because their humans were just too stupid to pay attention.
Yeah, the human factor is really what is the deciding factor in what a dog feels the need to do to defend themselves or to communicate with us.
Absolutely. It's we can't just blunder through life like a bull in a china shop with whether it's dogs or now, I'm not particularly a cat person, but cat people know that cats have specific behaviors that they perceive as being threatening. I know, having worked in the animal control world, that lots of other animals have different responses to different kinds of behaviors. People who have who have companions that are parrots, birds have an entirely different way of interpreting the world, and it's our responsibility to recognize those perceptions and to whether it's a bird or a dog, they can only act like a bird or a dog. We're the ones that have the option of learning their perceptions.
That's right. It's up to us. We have that ability, we have that brain capacity, and so it's our responsibility to do so, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh gosh, Jim, this has been awesome. I feel like this is chock full of such fantastic information. I could keep you here all day. I'm definitely going to pop down and visit you in Florida and come check out what you do, for sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's one of those things that it's either all or nothing. And right now I'm spending a lot of time sitting right here writing my dissertation and, inputting data into tables and analyzing things and so forth. But it's
an important piece of work.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. It's I've always found it kind of interesting. I've had a couple of people at various times talk about, we should do a TV show about what you do. Mm-hmm. Well, it would be a really bad TV show. Because if I say if I'm investigating a human fatality case, yeah, there's a lot of that 48 hours kind of looking around and interviewing people and all that crap. But the actual interaction with the dog, if everything goes well, it's really boring. Because if everything goes well, the dog may be a pain to begin with, but by the time I've put a lead on them and getting hands on them, we've developed a bond of trust, again, at least for a short period of time. And when I'm doing an evaluation, I'm not provoking a bite. All I want to see is those moments when they tense or they look funny or they give you that very first warning that a lot of people won't even pick up on until you show it to them on video later. So even if I've got a dog that's ripped somebody to pieces, the actual evaluation is not good TV.
Yeah.
It's really boring. And unlike some shows that are out there, and there are several of them, I'm not going to provoke a dog just to create a good TV moment. So once people have figured out that most of what I do is really boring, I'm just as happy not to be a TV star. Yeah, there's nothing. Again, if everything goes well, nothing happens.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not our job to make it worse. It's our job to make it better. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I find out what happened. I get information from the dog. I may well be there with a veterinarian if the dog's put down doing a necropsy to see if there's something organic that caused the problem. I may be standing next to a medical examiner going through an autopsy, documenting wounds and assisting with suggestions on where to collect DNA evidence from, measuring bite marks, all of the stuff, the technical stuff we do. But if everything's done right, that's all pretty boring.
Well, for the non-boring parts, for all the fun stuff that you have out there that people can learn from your plethora of experience, what's the best way to keep up with what you've got coming up and how people can continue learning from you?
Well, I do Google, so if you Google Jim Crosby dog, all kinds of crap comes up. I am out on Twitter at the dog guy Jim. I do have a presence on Facebook, but I rarely check it because I think that that's probably the center of evil in the universe. But, just kidding, Elon. Or Mark or whoever it is that runs that, yeah. But keep an eye out. When we've got something coming up, I really have to get back to having a website out there that's more present. If anybody's looking to contact me, especially if they have a serious or a fatal bite and they want some input, and that whether it's family members of somebody that's been bitten or attorneys, or especially if animal control or law enforcement are looking, they can email me, and it's easy. It's canine aggression, all spelled out, at gmail.com. So the word canine, the word aggression, no spaces or anything, canine aggression at gmail.com is probably the easiest way to contact me. Or you could actually email me at jimcrosbygator@ufl.edu.
Unless you're a Seminoles fan, right?
Well, yeah, I've got 2 daughters that graduated from Florida, and then I got my master's and finishing my doctorate. So, yeah, I guess that even though I did undergraduate work at Duke, that I really kind of qualify as a Gator these days. So
I think it's official. Well, thank you so much, Jim. I appreciate your time. This has been very enlightening and fascinating, and I think a lot of people listening will have some information to go forward when making decisions about dogs that are unfortunately put in some of these precarious positions. So thanks so much. And I'm going to put all of the links that you talked about, as well as some notes in the show notes too, about some of the other people that you've mentioned too, that people can kind of Google or follow the links that are in the description to learn more about bites and dog attacks.
And what I'll do too is I have a couple of things that are written out there that I'll send you some links or
Perfect.
Places where you can link. There's a dog bite investigative protocol that I put together.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
With questions and so forth. And there's a written document on application of the Dunbar scale to bite investigations.
Oh, perfect. That'd
So
be very good.
I'll send you a few links to some stuff, and you feel free to put that in the show notes, and people can click on through and find that stuff.
Excellent.
There's also a book that I wrote 2 chapters on. It's called Dog Bites: A Multidisciplinary Approach. It's that book.
Ah, yes.
It's edited by Dr. Daniel Mills and Dr. Kerry Westgarth over in the UK. It is available on Amazon. I've got 2 chapters in there, one on investigating bites and one on evaluating bite mark evidence. So, it's a little expensive, but unfortunately I don't get anything from it. But it's still a resource out there, so maybe if you've got 2 or 3 friends that want to get together and, each chip in 10 or $15, they can get it. If anybody's working in the animal control world or the shelter world and dealing with bites, try and get your agency to buy it for you, because there's my stuff, and it's kind of Eurocentric because it comes out of the UK, but there's a lot of good information in there.
Yeah, that's a good, valuable resource to have, for sure. Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate you having me. It's been fun.